A billionaire came home early one day and was shocked to find the housekeeper bathing his only son in the kitchen sink. His anger flared instantly. He rushed over, hurled offensive, racially charged words at her, and fired her on the spot. But from that day forward, his son no longer seemed happy. The boy's constant sadness gnawed at the billionaire, keeping him awake many nights. Eventually, unable to ignore his own unease, he reviewed the security footage from that day, only to be stunned by what he saw and filled with regret over his rash decision. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Marcus Thompson stepped through the front door of his Seattle mansion at exactly 3:47 p.m., 2 hours earlier than expected. The Denver Tech Summit had wrapped up ahead of schedule, and he'd caught the first flight home. His leather briefcase weighed heavy in his right hand, stuffed with contracts that could change everything for his company. But right now, all he wanted was to surprise his 4-year-old son Ethan with an early return. The house felt unusually quiet. No cartoons blaring from the living room TV. No sound of little feet running across the hardwood floors. Marcus set his briefcase down by the entrance table and loosened his tie. The silence struck him as odd. Where was Margaret, the new nanny he'd hired just 3 weeks ago? "Ethan, Daddy's home early," he called out, his voice echoing through the foyer. No response. Marcus walked toward the kitchen, following the faint sound of running water. Maybe Patricia was giving Ethan a snack. He pushed through the swinging kitchen door and froze completely. There, hunched over the large stainless steel sink, was Keisha Williams. Not Patricia. Keisha, the young black woman who cleaned his house twice a week and occasionally helped with Ethan when needed. She had her back to him, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and she was lifting his naked 4-year-old son out of what appeared to be a plastic basin filled with water right there in the kitchen sink. Marcus's brain short-circuited. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard he could hear it in his ears. The briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. "What in God's name are you doing to my son?" The words exploded from his throat before he could think. Keisha spun around, water dripping from her hands, her dark eyes wide with surprise. Ethan looked up at his father, confused by the sharp edge in his voice, soap bubbles still clinging to his small shoulders. "Sir, I can explain," Keisha said quickly, her voice steady, but Marcus could see the tension in her jaw. He had a fever and... "Get your hands off him right now!" Marcus lunged forward, his entire body coiled like a spring. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This is my child." Keisha immediately lifted Ethan higher, wrapping a soft towel around him with practiced movements, but Marcus saw it differently. He saw a stranger's hands on his vulnerable, naked son. He saw his child being handled in ways that made no sense in a place that made no sense. "Daddy," Ethan's small voice cut through the tension. "Miss Keisha was helping me feel better. I was hot. You don't get to decide what's best for my son." Marcus snapped, his voice rising with each word. His face was flushed, red veins visible at his temples. "This is completely inappropriate. What parent bathes their child in a kitchen sink like some kind of barn animal?" The words hung in the air like poison. Keisha's face went still, her expression shifting from concern to something deeper, something that looked like recognition of an old wound being reopened. "Sir, he had a fever of over 102 degrees, she said quietly, her southern accent slightly more pronounced now, the way it got when she was trying to stay calm. "This is something my mama taught me and her mama before that. A cool bath in a small space brings the fever down faster than..." "Oh, spare me the folk remedies." Marcus cut her off with a dismissive wave. "This isn't some backwoods shack in Mississippi. This is my home, my child, and you're here to clean floors, not practice your grandmother's voodoo medicine on my son." Keisha's hands trembled slightly as she held Ethan closer, but her voice remained controlled. "It's not voodoo, sir. It's basic fever management. When children spike high fevers, you need to cool them down gradually, and the kitchen sink provides..." "I don't want to hear it." Marcus stepped closer, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "You crossed a line. You don't take it upon yourself to undress my child. You don't put him in situations I haven't approved. You especially don't subject him to whatever backward remedies you learned wherever you're from." "Wherever I'm from," Keisha repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Something shifted in her eyes, a flash of pain that she quickly pushed down. "You know exactly what I mean. Marcus continued, his anger building momentum like a runaway train. This isn't how we do things in this family. This isn't how civilized people handle sick children. You call a doctor. You use modern medicine. You don't treat my son like he's some child from the projects. Ethan began to whimper, sensing the adult tension, even if he couldn't understand it. Miss Keisha was singing to me, he said in a small voice. She made the hot go away. That's enough, Marcus snapped. He reached for his son, and Keisha carefully transferred the towel-wrapped boy to his father's arms. Marcus could feel how warm Ethan still was, his small body radiating heat, but in his rage he interpreted this as evidence of Keisha's failure, not the fever she'd been trying to treat. Daddy, don't be mad at Miss Keisha, Ethan pleaded, looking back and forth between the two adults with confusion in his bright blue eyes. Marcus ignored his son's plea and locked his gaze on Keisha. She stood there, dripping water onto his expensive kitchen floor. Her work clothes soaked her dignity intact despite his verbal assault. Pack your things, he said, his voice cold and final. Leave your keys with Gerald. You're done here. Keisha's composure finally cracked. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and Marcus saw her blink rapidly, fighting back tears. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. Yes, sir. 2 words. That was all she said, but the way she said them with quiet dignity and profound sadness hit Marcus somewhere in his chest that he wasn't prepared for. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself further. She didn't even look angry. She just said, yes, sir, like she'd swallowed every ounce of fight she had left. No, Miss Keisha, don't go, Ethan cried out, reaching toward her with one small hand while clutching the towel with the other. I want you to stay. You make the hurt stop. Keisha's face crumpled for just a moment. She stepped forward and gently touched Ethan's cheek with trembling fingers. You be a good boy, okay? She whispered. Take care of yourself. But I don't want you to leave, Ethan sobbed, tears rolling down his flushed cheeks. I have to go, baby, Keisha said softly. She kissed the top of his head, a gesture so tender and maternal that for a split second Marcus felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. But he pushed that feeling down, buried it under his anger and his certainty that he'd done the right thing. Keisha straightened up, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and walked past Marcus without another word. Her wet footprints followed her across the marble floor, each one a small accusation he refused to acknowledge. The kitchen fell silent except for Ethan's quiet sniffling and the sound of water still dripping from the faucet. Marcus held his son tighter, telling himself he'd protected him. He'd done what any responsible father would do, but as Ethan continued to cry for Miss Keisha and as the echo of her dignified, yes, sir, lingered in the air, something cold and uncomfortable began to settle in Marcus's chest, something that felt suspiciously like doubt. 20 minutes after Keisha walked out of his house, Marcus Thompson stood in his living room, holding his still feverish son and staring at his phone. He'd already called 3 different nanny agencies, his voice clipped and professional, as he explained his urgent need for immediate childcare services. I need someone who can start tomorrow morning, he told the woman at Elite Childcare Services. Someone experienced, someone who understands boundaries. He didn't mention why his previous arrangement had ended so abruptly. Ethan sat curled in his father's lap on the leather sofa, his small body still radiating heat despite the children's Tylenol Marcus had given him. The boy kept looking toward the kitchen, then at the front door, his blue eyes filled with confusion and loss. When is Miss Keisha coming back? Ethan asked for the 4th time in 10 minutes, his voice small and congested. She's not coming back, Marcus replied, not looking down at his son. He was scrolling through his contacts, trying to remember if any of his business associates had recommendations for emergency childcare. But why? Ethan pressed, sniffling. She was helping me feel better. Marcus felt his jaw tighten again. Because she didn't follow the rules, buddy. Sometimes adults make choices that aren't appropriate. What's inappropriate mean? It means doing things the wrong way, Marcus said tersely. Miss Keisha should have called me before doing what she did. She should have taken you to a doctor. Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said, but I feel better now. The hot is almost gone. Marcus ignored the comment. He couldn't acknowledge it, couldn't let himself consider what it might mean. Instead, he focused on the phone calls, the arrangements, the immediate practical needs. By 6 p.m., he'd secured Margaret Hendricks, a 62-year-old former pediatric nurse with impeccable references and availability, starting the next morning. She arrived at 7 for a brief introduction, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her manner efficient and professional. "I understand you need someone immediately," Margaret said, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "I can assure you, Mr. Thompson, that I follow all proper protocols. I believe in structure routine and clear communication with parents." "That's exactly what we need," Marcus replied, relief flooding through him. This was what proper childcare looked like. Professional, clean, no surprises. Ethan, however, took one look at Margaret and immediately hid behind his father's legs. "Hello there, young man," Margaret said in a cheerful but distant voice. "I'm going to be taking care of you starting tomorrow." Ethan pressed his face against Marcus's pants and didn't respond. "He's just tired," Marcus explained quickly. "It's been a long day." But the next morning brought its own challenges. Margaret arrived at exactly 7 a.m. as promised, with a structured daily schedule and a bag full of educational activities. She was everything Marcus thought he wanted: organized, experienced professional. Ethan wanted nothing to do with her. "Come now, Ethan," Margaret said in her practiced, cheerful voice. "It's time for breakfast. I've prepared oatmeal with proper nutritional supplements." "I don't want oatmeal," Ethan said, pushing the bowl away. "Miss Keisha makes pancakes with faces." "Miss Keisha is no longer your caregiver," Margaret replied firmly, "and oatmeal is much more nutritious than sugary pancakes." Ethan stared at her for a moment, then deliberately knocked the bowl off the table. It shattered across the kitchen floor, oatmeal splattering everywhere. "Ethan!" Marcus snapped, rushing into the kitchen at the sound of breaking dishes. "What's gotten into you?" His son stood there with tears streaming down his face, his small hands clenched into fists. "I want Miss Keisha. I want Miss Keisha to come back." "Well, that's not going to happen," Margaret said, matter-of-factly, already reaching for a mop. "Some people simply aren't equipped to handle children properly." The comment hit Marcus like a slap. He looked at Margaret, then at his sobbing son, and felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach, but he pushed the feeling away. "Ethan, apologize to Miss Margaret right now," he commanded. "No!" Ethan screamed louder than Marcus had ever heard him scream. "I hate her. I want Miss Keisha. She was nice to me." The tantrum that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed from his normally well-behaved son. Ethan threw himself on the floor, kicking and sobbing with a desperation that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. Nothing Margaret did helped. Her attempts at distraction fell flat. Her stern corrections only made things worse. Finally, Gerald appeared in the doorway. The 68-year-old man had been with the Thompson family for 25 years, had helped raise Marcus himself after his mother died. Gerald rarely spoke, unless spoken to, maintained professional boundaries. Marcus respected, but right now his weathered face showed something Marcus had never seen before: disappointment. "Perhaps," Gerald said quietly, his British accent more pronounced than usual, "the young master is grieving." "Grieving," Marcus repeated. "It's not like someone died, Gerald. Keisha was just the help." Gerald's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. He moved past Margaret, knelt down beside the screaming Ethan, and simply sat with him. He didn't try to shush him or correct him or explain why his feelings were wrong. He just waited. Gradually, Ethan's sobs subsided into hiccups and sniffles. "She sang to me when I was scared," Ethan whispered to Gerald. "She made the hurt stop. Why did Daddy make her go away?" Gerald glanced up at Marcus, and there was something in that look that made Marcus's chest tighten. Not accusation exactly, but a quiet, profound sadness that seemed to encompass more than just this morning's tantrum. "Sometimes," Gerald said carefully, "adults make decisions when they're frightened, and sometimes those decisions hurt people they don't mean to hurt." Marcus felt his face flush. "I wasn't frightened. I was protecting my son." "Of course, sir," Gerald replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The rest of the day continued in similar fashion. Margaret tried everything she'd learned in her 30 years of childcare, but Ethan remained sullen and uncooperative. He refused to eat lunch. He knocked over his building blocks during what was supposed to be educational playtime. When she tried to read to him, he simply walked away. "This is highly unusual behavior," Margaret told Marcus when he returned from work that evening. "Most children adjust to new caregivers within a day or two. This child seems to have formed an unusually strong attachment to your previous employee." Marcus looked at his son, who was sitting alone on the floor in the corner of the living room, quietly pushing a toy car back and forth with no real interest or joy. "He'll adjust," Marcus said, but even as he spoke the words, he felt doubt creeping in. That night, after Margaret had gone home and Gerald had served dinner in unusual silence, Marcus sat in his study with a glass of whiskey he couldn't bring himself to drink. The house felt different somehow. Quieter, yes, but also emptier, like something essential had been removed. From upstairs, he could hear Ethan crying softly in his bedroom. Not the angry tantrum from that morning, but something worse. A sad, lonely sound that seemed to seep through the floorboards and settle into Marcus's bones. He kept telling himself he'd done the right thing. He'd protected his son. He'd maintained appropriate boundaries. He'd acted like any responsible father would act. But Ethan's tears told a different story. And Gerald's disappointed silence told another. And somewhere in a part of his mind Marcus wasn't ready to examine, he could still hear Keisha's voice. "Yes, sir." So quiet, so dignified, so completely defeated. He'd won, hadn't he? He'd established his authority. He'd protected his family's standards. So why did victory feel so much like loss? 3 days into Margaret's employment, Marcus Thompson found himself standing alone in his home office at 11 p.m. staring at the security monitor mounted on his desk. He'd sent Margaret home early after another disastrous day with Ethan, who had refused to eat anything except crackers and had spent most of the afternoon hiding under his bed. Gerald had cleaned up after dinner with the same pointed silence he'd maintained since Keisha left, and Ethan had finally cried himself to sleep after asking for the 15th time when Miss Keisha was coming back. Marcus told himself he was checking the security footage to review the house's safety protocols. That's what he told himself as his fingers hovered over the keyboard. But deep down, he knew exactly what he was looking for. He scrolled back to Tuesday afternoon, 3:47 p.m. The timestamp glowed green in the corner of the screen as he watched himself walk through the front door briefcase in hand tie, slightly loosened from the flight. His chest tightened as he saw himself set down the briefcase and call out for Ethan. The audio was clear enough to catch his cheerful "Daddy's home early" echoing through the empty foyer. Then came the walk to the kitchen. Marcus watched himself push through the swinging door, and he saw his own body language change instantly. The way his shoulders went rigid, the way his hands clenched into fists, the way his face contorted with shock and rage. But the camera angle also showed him something else, something he hadn't seen in the heat of the moment: Keisha's face. She wasn't startled or guilty when she heard his voice. She was smiling. Actually smiling as she lifted Ethan from the basin, her movements careful and deliberate. She was humming something under her breath, and Ethan was giggling completely relaxed in her arms. Marcus paused the video and leaned closer to the screen. Keisha's expression was one of pure tenderness as she wrapped the towel around Ethan. There was nothing furtive or inappropriate about her actions. She moved like someone who had done this before. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing. He rewound and watched again. This time he noticed other details. The way Keisha tested the water temperature with her elbow before lifting Ethan out. The way she kept one hand supporting his back at all times. The way she checked his forehead with the back of her hand. These weren't the movements of someone playing with a child or indulging in folk remedies. These were practiced professional movements. Marcus's throat felt tight as he watched the confrontation unfold on screen. He saw himself exploding into the kitchen, saw his own face twisted with fury and disgust. He heard his own voice hurling those words: barn animal, backwoods shack, wherever you're from. But what made his stomach lurch was seeing Keisha's reaction. She didn't look surprised by his anger. She looked hurt, yes, but not surprised, like she'd been expecting this moment, dreading it, but knowing it would come. She was prepared for this. Marcus whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the quiet office. He watched her try to explain about the fever, saw how calmly she spoke, even as he berated her. He noticed how she never raised her voice, never responded to his insults with anger of her own. She just absorbed it all with a dignity that now made him feel sick to his stomach. The audio picked up Ethan's small voice. "Miss Keisha was helping me feel better. I was hot." Marcus had dismissed those words in the moment, too angry to hear them. But now, watching his son's flushed face on the monitor, he could see what he'd missed. Ethan wasn't just warm from a bath. His cheeks were bright red, his hair damp with sweat that had nothing to do with the water. The boy had clearly been running a significant fever. Marcus fast-forwarded through the rest of the confrontation, his jaw clenching as he watched himself fire Keisha. He saw her face crumple for just a moment when Ethan begged her not to leave. He saw the kiss she placed on his son's forehead, so gentle and loving it could have been from a mother. And he saw her walk away with her wet footprints trailing behind her, her shoulders straight, despite the verbal assault she'd just endured. The video ended, and Marcus sat in the silence of his office, staring at the blank screen. His hands were shaking slightly, and there was a bitter taste in his mouth that had nothing to do with the coffee he'd been drinking. A soft knock on his office door made him jump. "Come in," he called quickly, minimizing the security program. Gerald entered carrying a tea service on a silver tray, his expression as carefully neutral as it had been for days. "I thought you might need something before bed, sir," Gerald said, setting the tray on the side table. "Thank you," Marcus replied, then hesitated. "Gerald, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sir." Marcus studied the older man's face, looking for some clue about how to phrase his question. "The day I fired Keisha, did you see her before she left?" Gerald's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I walked her to her car. And what, sir?" Marcus felt frustration building in his chest. "Did she say anything about what happened?" Gerald was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see him carefully considering his words. Finally, he spoke. "She asked me to make sure you knew that Master Ethan's fever had broken. She was concerned that you might not realize he'd been genuinely ill." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "She was still worried about Ethan after I—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Miss Keisha cares deeply for the boy," Gerald said quietly, "perhaps more than is wise for someone in her position." "What do you mean by that?" Gerald met his eyes directly. "Sir, if I may speak plainly." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what came next. "Miss Keisha has been caring for Master Ethan for over a year. Not just cleaning, sir, really caring for him. She's the one who taught him to tie his shoes. She's the one who sits with him when he has nightmares. She's the one who remembers that he likes his sandwiches cut diagonally and that he's afraid of the vacuum cleaner." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I thought Margaret was his primary caregiver." "Miss Margaret lasted 3 weeks, sir. Before that, it was Miss Jennifer for 2 months. Before her, Miss Caroline for 6 weeks. Gerald's voice remained respectful, but his meaning was clear. "Miss Keisha has been the constant in Master Ethan's life since his mother passed." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Marcus thought about all those nannies, all those failed arrangements. He'd assumed it was just the difficulty of finding good help, the challenge of dealing with a grieving child. He'd never considered that maybe Ethan had been grieving the loss of each caregiver only to find comfort with the quiet young woman who cleaned their house. "Gerald," Marcus said slowly, "what was Keisha doing before she started working here?" "I believe she was studying nursing, sir, at the community college." "Nursing," Marcus's voice came out strangled. "Yes, sir. Pediatric nursing, I believe. She mentioned once that she hoped to work with children in hospitals." Gerald paused. "She had to leave school when her grandmother became ill. Needed the income from cleaning houses to pay for her grandmother's medical care." Marcus felt the room spinning around him. A nursing student, pediatric nursing. She hadn't been playing with his son or practicing folk medicine. She'd been applying actual medical knowledge to bring down a dangerous fever. "Sir," Gerald's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Marcus looked up at him, and for the first time in 25 years, he saw something other than professional deference in Gerald's eyes. He saw disappointment so profound, it made Marcus want to disappear. "I made a terrible mistake," Marcus whispered. Gerald didn't contradict him. He simply nodded once and said, "Yes, sir, I believe you did." Marcus Thompson didn't sleep that night. After Gerald left his office, he sat staring at his laptop screen until the early hours of morning, the cursor blinking in the search bar like an accusation. Finally, at 2:30 a.m., he typed in the words he'd been avoiding, Keisha Williams, Seattle. The first result was a LinkedIn profile with a photo that made his chest tighten. There was Keisha, maybe 2 years younger, wearing a white lab coat and smiling at the camera with the kind of bright hope that only young people pursuing their dreams possessed. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore a stethoscope around her neck like a badge of honor. Marcus clicked on the profile with trembling fingers. Keisha Williams, nursing student at Seattle Community College, aspiring pediatric nurse, Dean's List 2019-2020, passionate about providing health care to underserved communities. The words blurred as Marcus read them. Dean's List. She hadn't just been studying nursing, she'd been excelling at it. He scrolled down to her experience section and found internships at Children's Hospital, volunteer work at free clinics, tutoring positions, helping other students with anatomy and physiology. Under achievements, he found something that made his breath catch. Recipient of the Future Healers Scholarship, awarded to nursing students who demonstrate exceptional academic performance and commitment to pediatric care. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the laptop screen casting blue light across his face in the dark office. A scholarship recipient, top of her class, specialized in pediatrics, and he'd dismissed her knowledge as grandmother's voodoo medicine. He clicked on the education section and found Seattle Community College's nursing program. According to the timestamps, Keisha had been scheduled to graduate this past spring, but her profile showed no graduation date, no recent updates. The last entry was from 18 months ago. Marcus opened a new tab and searched for Seattle Community College nursing program requirements. What he found made his stomach churn. The program was highly competitive with rigorous coursework in anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and pediatric care. Students were required to complete hundreds of hours of clinical rotations in real hospitals with real patients. This wasn't some hobby or casual interest. This was serious medical training. He found himself typing fever reduction techniques pediatric nursing into Google. The results that came up made him feel physically sick. Cool water baths, gradual temperature reduction, small spaces to concentrate cooling effects. Everything Keisha had done was listed in medical journals and nursing textbooks as proper fever management for young children. She hadn't been practicing folk medicine. She'd been practicing real medicine. Marcus spent the next hour diving deeper into Keisha's digital footprint. Her Facebook page, though private, showed public posts from 2 years ago about being accepted into the nursing program. Photos of her in scrubs during clinical rotations, always smiling, always surrounded by other young people who looked like they were pursuing something meaningful. Then the posts stopped abruptly. The last public update was a photo of an elderly black woman in a hospital bed with Keisha sitting beside her holding her hand. The caption read, "Granny's fighting pneumonia, but she's tough. Family first always. School can wait." Marcus stared at that photo for a long time. The love in Keisha's face as she looked at her grandmother was unmistakable. This wasn't someone who'd dropped out of school carelessly. This was someone who'd made a sacrifice. He found himself clicking through to the nursing school's website, looking up tuition costs, program requirements, readmission policies. The financial investment was substantial, especially for someone working cleaning jobs to pay for a grandmother's medical care. At 4 a.m., Marcus finally closed the laptop, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd discovered. He kept seeing that photo of Keisha in the lab coat, kept thinking about her gentle hands testing the water temperature, kept hearing her voice. "Sir, you have a fever, more than 100 degrees. She'd known exactly what she was doing. She'd probably saved Ethan from a trip to the emergency room, maybe prevented febrile seizures or worse complications. And he'd repaid her medical expertise with racial slurs and humiliation. When Gerald brought him coffee at 7 a.m., Marcus looked up from his desk where he'd been sitting motionless for hours. "Gerald, I need you to help me find Keisha's address." Gerald set down the coffee cup carefully. "Sir, I need to see her. I need to apologize." Marcus's voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. "What I did was unforgivable, but I have to try." "Sir, if I may," Gerald said quietly, "an apology might not be enough." Marcus looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "Miss Keisha sacrificed her education to care for her grandmother. Her dreams have been on hold for nearly 2 years. Perhaps if you truly wish to make amends, you might consider how to help her reclaim what she lost." Gerald's words made Marcus realize what he needed to do. Of course, an apology was just words. But helping her return to school, helping her finish what she'd started, helping her become the pediatric nurse she was meant to be, that would be real restitution. "Gerald, do you know if she's tried to re-enroll in the nursing program?" "I believe financial constraints have made that impossible, sir. Her grandmother's medical bills have been substantial, and Miss Keisha has been working multiple cleaning jobs to manage the debt." Marcus felt shame wash over him again. While he'd been paying her a modest hourly wage to clean his house, she'd been struggling to keep her family afloat and her dreams alive. And when she'd used her medical training to help his son, he'd destroyed what little stability she had. "Find her address," Marcus said, standing up from his desk. "I'm going to see her today." "Sir, are you certain this is wise? She may not wish to see you." Marcus thought about that LinkedIn photo, about the hope in Keisha's young face as she'd posed in her lab coat. He thought about the gentle way she'd cared for Ethan, the professional knowledge she'd applied to a crisis situation, the dignity with which she'd accepted his verbal assault. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I owe her the chance to tell me that herself. I owe her a real apology." And Gerald, "Yes, sir. I owe her a lot more than that." The drive to South Seattle took Marcus Thompson through neighborhoods he'd never seen before, despite living in the city for over a decade. His BMW felt conspicuous as he navigated streets lined with modest bungalows, corner markets with hand-painted signs, and children playing on front lawns that were small but carefully maintained. Gerald had given him an address on Cherry Street along with a warning, "Her grandmother is protective, sir, and Miss Keisha may not be in a forgiving mood." Marcus parked across the street from a pale yellow house with white trim. The paint was faded but not peeling, and the small front yard was neat with flower boxes under the windows. A wind chime hung from the covered porch, moving gently in the afternoon breeze. He sat in his car for 10 minutes, trying to find the courage to walk up those front steps. What was he supposed to say? How do you apologize for calling someone's heritage backward? How do you take back words that revealed the ugliness you'd been carrying inside? Finally, he forced himself out of the car and across the street. Each step felt heavier than the last. He climbed the 3 concrete steps to the porch and knocked on the screen door. The inner door opened immediately, as if someone had been watching from the window. A black woman in her 70s appeared behind the screen, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. She wore a floral house dress and an expression that could have cut glass. "Can I help you?" she asked, not moving to unlock the screen door. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Keisha Williams. My name is Marcus Thompson." The woman's expression hardened. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Thompson." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "I came to speak with Keisha, to apologize." "Apologize?" The woman's voice carried decades of experience with insincere apologies from powerful men. "That's mighty generous of you showing up here after what you did. Ma'am, I know I have no right to ask, but could I please just see her 5 minutes? That's all I need." The older woman studied him for a long moment, her gaze so intense, Marcus felt like she was reading his soul. Finally, she called over her shoulder, "Keisha, you got company." Marcus heard footsteps inside the house, and then Keisha appeared in the doorway. She looked different than she had in his kitchen 5 days ago. She wore jeans and an oversized sweatshirt, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back for work. But what struck him most was her face. The careful neutrality she'd always maintained in his presence was gone, replaced by something raw and more real. Her eyes were slightly swollen, whether from crying or lack of sleep, he couldn't tell. When she saw him, she went very still. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly. Marcus's prepared speech evaporated. Standing there, looking at her, seeing the weariness in her posture and the guardedness in her eyes, he felt the full weight of what he'd done. "I came to return this," he said, pulling a small paper bag from his jacket pocket. "You left it at the house." Keisha looked at the bag, but didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "Your scarf, the yellow one." She still didn't move to take it. "Is that all?" Marcus took a shaky breath. "No. I came to tell you I was wrong. About everything." "Wrong about what exactly?" Her voice was steady, but he could hear the steel underneath. "Wrong about what you were doing with Ethan. Wrong about your methods. Wrong about your knowledge. Wrong about you." The words tumbled out faster now. "I watched the security footage. I saw how you cared for him. I looked up your background, your nursing training. You weren't practicing folk medicine. You were practicing real medicine." Keisha's grandmother made a soft sound behind the screen door, something between a snort and a laugh. "Took you long enough to figure that out?" Marcus looked at the older woman, then back at Keisha. "I said things I can never take back. I called your knowledge backward when you probably know more about pediatric care than I ever will. I treated you like you were ignorant when you were using your medical training to help my son. And," Keisha asked, crossing her arms, "and I'm sorry, deeply, truly sorry, not just for firing you, but for the way I spoke to you, for the things I said about your background, your family, your knowledge. It was racist and cruel and completely unjustified." Keisha stared at him for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "Do you know what hurt the most, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus shook his head. "It wasn't losing the job. It wasn't even the things you said about my grandmother's wisdom." She paused, and he saw pain flicker across her face. "It was that I'd been caring for your son for over a year. I'd been there for his nightmares, his scraped knees, his questions about his mama. I thought you knew me better than that. I thought you trusted me." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. "You're right. I did know you better. And I threw all of that away because I was scared and angry, and I let my worst instincts take over." "Your worst instincts," Keisha repeated slowly. "Is that what you call it?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I call it racism. I saw a black woman with my white child in what looked like an unusual situation, and my brain went to the worst possible places. I didn't see Keisha, the woman who'd been caring for my son with love and skill. I saw a stereotype, and I'm ashamed of that." Keisha's grandmother stepped closer to the screen door. "What exactly do you want from her, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus looked between the two women. "I want to make this right. I want to help Keisha get back into nursing school. I want to pay her tuition, cover her expenses, whatever it takes for her to finish her degree." Keisha's eyes widened slightly. "Why would you do that?" "Because you sacrificed your education to care for your grandmother, and then I destroyed your income for using that education to help my son. Because you deserve to be the pediatric nurse you were meant to be. Because it's the right thing to do." "And what about Ethan?" Keisha asked quietly. Marcus's voice softened. "He misses you terribly. He hasn't eaten a proper meal since you left. He keeps asking when you're coming back. The new nanny and we don't know how to comfort him the way you did." Keisha looked down at her hands. "I miss him too. Would you consider coming back? Not as a housekeeper, as his caregiver, with a proper contract, proper pay, and the respect you should have had from the beginning." Keisha was quiet for so long, Marcus thought she might not answer. Finally, she looked up at him. "I'll think about it," she said. "Both offers. But, Mr. Thompson, yes. If I do come back, things will be different. I won't stay quiet if something feels wrong. I won't accept being treated as less than. And I won't pretend your apology erases what happened." Marcus nodded. "I understand, and I wouldn't want you to." Keisha's grandmother opened the screen door and handed Marcus a glass of sweet tea he hadn't asked for. "Might as well sit down," she said. "This conversation ain't over yet." As Marcus took the glass with trembling hands, he realized this was just the beginning. The real work of earning back trust, of proving his words with actions, of becoming the man his son needed him to be, that work was still ahead of him. But for the first time in 5 days, he felt something other than shame and regret. He felt hope. 3 days later, Marcus Thompson stood in his foyer at exactly 8 a.m. adjusting his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. He'd barely slept the night before, replaying every word of his conversation with Keisha and her grandmother. After 2 hours on that front porch sharing sweet tea and enduring the most uncomfortable but necessary conversation of his life, Keisha had agreed to return, but not as his employee, as his partner in raising Ethan. The doorbell rang, and Marcus felt his heart jump. He opened the door to find Keisha standing on his front step, wearing dark jeans, a cream-colored blouse, and an expression that was professional but guarded. In her hand, she carried a small folder and a canvas tote bag. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said formally. "Good morning. Please come in." Marcus stepped aside, acutely aware of how different this felt from all the times she'd entered through the back door to begin her cleaning duties. Keisha walked into the foyer and set her bag down carefully. "Before we go any further, I have something for you to review." She handed him the folder. Inside was a typed contract, professionally formatted and thorough. Marcus scanned the first page, his eyebrows rising as he read. Position titled Child Care Specialist and Family Care Coordinator. He read aloud. Salary. He paused, looking up at her. "This is 3 times what I was paying you before." "It's the market rate for professional child care in Seattle," Keisha replied evenly. "I researched it thoroughly, and given my medical training and the specialized care Ethan requires as a child who's experienced trauma and loss, I believe it's appropriate." Marcus continued reading. The contract spelled out everything: work hours, responsibilities, boundaries, and expectations. There were clauses about respectful communication, decision-making protocols, and professional development support. "You'll notice the section about educational assistance," Keisha said, pointing to a paragraph halfway down the second page. Marcus read it carefully. tuition support for completion of nursing degree with the understanding that upon graduation, employment terms may be renegotiated to accommodate new career goals. He looked up at her. You're already planning your exit strategy. I'm planning my future, Keisha corrected. I want to be a pediatric nurse, Mr. Thompson. That hasn't changed. But I also care about Ethan, and I want to make sure he's stable and secure before I move on to the next phase of my career. The honesty was refreshing and slightly intimidating. Marcus had never had an employee speak to him so directly about their long-term goals. Where do I sign? He asked. Keisha blinked clearly, having expected more negotiation. You don't want to have your lawyer review it first. I trust you, Marcus said, then caught himself. I want to trust you. I want to earn back the right to trust you. A small sound from the staircase made them both turn. Ethan sat on the third step, still in his pajamas, staring at Keisha with wide eyes as if she might disappear if he looked away. Miss Keisha, he whispered. Her professional composure cracked immediately. Hey there, sweet boy. Ethan launched himself down the stairs and straight into her arms. Keisha caught him easily, lifting him up as he wrapped his small arms around her neck and buried his face in her shoulder. I missed you so much, he mumbled against her shirt. I thought you were never coming back. I missed you too, Keisha said softly, her voice thick with emotion. But I'm here now, okay? I'm here. Marcus watched the reunion with a mixture of joy and guilt. The way his son clung to Keisha, the way his whole body seemed to relax for the first time in a week, made it clear just how much damage Marcus's decision had caused. Are you staying forever now? Ethan asked, pulling back to look at Keisha's face. I'm staying for a long time, she promised, and we're going to have some new rules that make sure nothing like last week ever happens again. What kind of rules? Keisha glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. Well, your daddy and I are going to work together to take care of you, and if you ever get sick again, we're going to talk to each other about the best way to help you feel better. Like when I had the hot feeling, exactly like that. I should have called your daddy before I gave you that cool bath, and your daddy should have asked me questions before he got upset. Marcus was struck by how she explained it to Ethan. She didn't make herself the victim or Marcus the villain. She presented it as a problem they'd solved together, a misunderstanding that had led to better communication. Can we have pancakes now? Ethan asked. The kind with faces. Keisha laughed. That's up to your daddy. I'm not just the cook anymore. Remember, I'm here to take care of you in lots of different ways. Ethan looked between them. What does that mean? It means Miss Keisha is going to help you with your schoolwork and your feelings and keeping you healthy, Marcus explained. And she's also going to go back to school herself to become an even better helper for children. Like a doctor. Like a nurse, Keisha said. A special nurse who takes care of kids. Ethan considered this. Will you still sing to me? Always, Keisha promised. An hour later, after Marcus had signed the contract and Margaret had been called to collect her final paycheck, the three of them sat in the kitchen eating pancakes with chocolate chip smiles and blueberry eyes. It felt surreal to Marcus, this new dynamic where Keisha sat at the table as an equal rather than serving from the sidelines. I've enrolled in evening classes, Keisha said, cutting Ethan's pancakes into smaller pieces. 3 nights a week. I can be here for Ethan's dinner and bedtime routine, but you'll need to handle the evening hours on those days. Of course, Marcus agreed. Whatever you need. I also want to establish some communication protocols, she continued. If Ethan gets sick, we call each other immediately. No one makes medical decisions alone unless it's an emergency. Agreed. And Mr. Thompson, Keisha looked at him directly. I need you to know that I'm going to speak up if something doesn't feel right. I'm not going to stay quiet to keep the peace. Marcus met her gaze. I hope you will speak up. I need you to. Ethan needs you to. Gerald appeared in the kitchen doorway, his usual morning tea service balanced on a silver tray. When he saw the three of them sitting together at the table, his face broke into the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from him in a week. Good morning, Miss Keisha, he said warmly. It's wonderful to have you back. It's good to be back, Gerald, though things are going to be a little different now. Different how? Gerald asked, setting down the tea service. Miss Keisha is going to be Ethan's official caregiver, Marcus explained. And she's going back to school to become a nurse. Gerald's smile widened. Outstanding. The house hasn't felt right without you, miss. As they finished breakfast, Marcus found himself watching Keisha interact with his son. The easy affection between them, the way she anticipated his needs, the gentle firmness when he tried to feed pancakes to the dog under the table. This was what family looked like, he realized. Not perfect, not without complications, but real and loving and committed. "Miss Keisha," Ethan said as she wiped syrup from his chin. "Are you happy now?" Keisha glanced at Marcus, then back at the little boy. "I'm getting there, sweet boy. How about you?" Ethan grinned, his face sticky with syrup and joy. "I'm happy you're home." And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Marcus felt something other than guilt and regret. He felt gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a new kind of family. 2 weeks into their new arrangement, Marcus Thompson received a letter that made his blood run cold. The envelope bore the elegant letterhead of Riverside Academy, Seattle's most prestigious private preschool, where Ethan was enrolled for the fall term. Marcus opened it in his home office while Keisha was upstairs helping Ethan with his afternoon quiet time. The letter was diplomatically worded, but its meaning was unmistakable. "Dear Mr. Thompson, we hope this letter finds you well. As we prepare for the upcoming academic year, we wanted to reach out regarding the recent changes in Ethan's care arrangements. While we respect every family's right to make their own child care decisions, we feel it's important to ensure that all caregivers who interact with our school community meet our institutional standards and expectations." The letter went on to request a meeting to discuss the transition and ensure alignment with our educational philosophy. Marcus crumpled the paper in his fist. They weren't asking to meet Keisha, they were asking him to justify her. That evening, after Ethan was asleep, Marcus showed the letter to Keisha. She read it twice, her expression growing colder with each word. "They want to interview me," she said flatly, "like I'm some kind of security risk." "We don't have to do this," Marcus said. "There are other schools." Keisha looked at him sharply. "You'd consider changing schools because of me." "I'd consider changing schools because of them. If they can't see your qualifications, if they're going to treat you like a threat instead of a professional, then they don't deserve Ethan." Keisha was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "No, we're not running from this. If we move Ethan now, it sends the message that they were right to be concerned. And what happens to the next family like ours?" Marcus studied her face. "You want to face them directly. I want to walk into that school with my head high and show them exactly who I am. Let them make their judgments to my face instead of behind closed doors." 3 days later, they walked into Riverside Academy together. The school occupied a converted mansion in Capitol Hill, all brick facades and ivy-covered walls that screamed old money and older traditions. Marcus had chosen it because of its academic reputation, but now he was seeing it through different eyes. The moment they entered the main office, Marcus felt the shift in atmosphere. Mrs. Caroline Westbrook, the head of admissions, greeted him with her usual warm smile, but her eyes kept flicking to Keisha with barely concealed curiosity. "Mr. Thompson, so wonderful to see you. And this must be—" She paused, clearly unsure how to address Keisha. "This is Keisha Williams," Marcus said firmly, "Ethan's child care specialist." "Of course. Please, both of you, come into my office at—" Mrs. Westbrook's office was a shrine to privileged leather-bound books, mahogany furniture, and photographs of her shaking hands with various politicians and celebrities. She gestured for them to sit in the chairs across from her desk, but Marcus noticed that she directed her attention exclusively to him. "Mr. Thompson, I want to start by saying how excited we are to have Ethan join our community this fall. His application was simply outstanding." "Thank you," Marcus replied. "We're looking forward to it as well. Now, about Mrs. Westbrook glanced at a file on her desk. "Miss Williams, we'd like to understand her role in Ethan's daily care, particularly as it relates to school activities." Keisha leaned forward slightly. "I'd be happy to answer any questions you have directly, Mrs. Westbrook." The older woman's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Could you tell us about your background in childcare?" "I have over 2 years of experience caring for children, including specialized training in early childhood development. I'm currently completing my nursing degree with a focus on pediatrics." "Nursing school. How interesting." Mrs. Westbrook's tone suggested it was anything but. "And where are you pursuing this degree?" "Seattle Community College." Marcus watched Mrs. Westbrook's expression shift subtly. Seattle Community College wasn't Harvard or even University of Washington. In her world, it probably didn't count as a real education. "I see. And what specific qualifications do you have for handling the complex needs of academically advanced children? The question was loaded with assumptions and condescension. Marcus felt his temper rising, but Keisha remained perfectly calm. I have extensive experience with trauma-informed care, which is particularly relevant for children who've experienced loss, as Ethan has. I'm trained in developmental psychology, pediatric first aid, and behavioral management techniques. I also have practical experience supporting children through medical emergencies, which proved valuable when Ethan experienced a high fever recently. Mrs. Westbrook made notes on her legal pad. Yes, we heard there was some sort of incident recently. Marcus's hands clenched in his lap. There was no incident. Keisha provided excellent medical care when my son was ill. Of course, of course. We're simply trying to understand the full picture. Mrs. Westbrook's smile was razor thin. Miss Williams, could you describe your approach to discipline and behavioral guidance? For the next 20 minutes, Mrs. Westbrook peppered Keisha with questions that grew increasingly pointed. She asked about Keisha's cultural background and how it might influence her childcare methods. She inquired whether Keisha understood the expectations of families in their community. She even asked with barely disguised horror whether Keisha planned to introduce Ethan to any non-traditional practices. Through it all, Keisha answered with grace and professionalism that made Marcus want to applaud. She didn't take the bait when Mrs. Westbrook made veiled references to urban culture or different value systems. She simply stated her qualifications, her approach, and her commitment to Ethan's well-being. Finally, Mrs. Westbrook leaned back in her chair. Well, this has been very illuminating. We'll need to discuss this with our board of directors, of course. Discuss what exactly? Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Whether this arrangement aligns with our institutional values and the expectations of our parent community. Marcus stood up slowly. Let me make something very clear, Mrs. Westbrook. Keisha Williams is the most qualified childcare professional I've ever encountered. She has medical training, practical experience, and a level of dedication to my son that goes far beyond what any job description could require. If your institutional values can't recognize that level of excellence, then perhaps this isn't the right school for us. Mrs. Westbrook's composure slipped slightly. Mr. Thompson, please don't misunderstand. We're simply trying to ensure that all of our families feel comfortable with... Comfortable with what? Keisha asked quietly. With me. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Westbrook realized she'd been backed into a corner where any answer would reveal her true motivations. I think we're done here, Marcus said, reaching for Keisha's hand. We'll be in touch about our final decision regarding enrollment. As they walked out of the office, Marcus could feel eyes following them from every corner of the building. Parents dropping off paperwork, teachers preparing classrooms, administrators pretending to be busy while actually watching the drama unfold. In the parking lot, Keisha was quiet as they got into the car. I'm sorry, Marcus said as he started the engine. I'm so sorry you had to endure that. Keisha looked out the window. I've endured worse. But it never stops hurting when people look at your skin color and see a threat instead of a person. We're finding a different school. No, Keisha said firmly. We're going to let them make their decision, and then we'll make ours. If they reject us, it says everything about them and nothing about us. If they accept us, then Ethan gets a good education, and we prove that families like ours belong in places like this. Marcus pulled out of the parking lot, but he could see Mrs. Westbrook watching them through her office window. The real battle, he realized, wasn't in that office. It was in every assumption, every sideways glance, every coded question about institutional fit. But as he looked at Keisha, sitting tall and dignified, despite the humiliation she'd just endured, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Pride, not just in her, but in them. In the family they were building together, one difficult conversation at a time. The letter would come in 3 days. But whatever it said, they would face it together. The rejection letter from Riverside Academy arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered in the same elegant envelope that had started this whole ordeal. Marcus read it twice before showing it to Keisha, who was helping Ethan build a tower with blocks in the living room. After careful consideration of all factors, she read aloud, "We regret to inform you that we cannot offer enrollment to Ethan Thompson at this time. While his academic qualifications are exceptional, we feel that the current care arrangement may not align with our educational community's expectations." Ethan looked up from his blocks. "What's that mean?" "It means that school isn't the right fit for us, buddy," Marcus said, surprised by how relieved he felt. But Keisha wasn't done reading. However, she continued, we want to commend the Thompson family for their commitment to diversity and inclusion. We hope you'll consider reapplying in the future should circumstances change. Should circumstances change, Marcus repeated bitterly. They mean if we get rid of you. Actually, Keisha said, setting down the letter with a thoughtful expression, I think they just gave us exactly what we need. Marcus looked at her in confusion. How do you figure? They put their bias in writing. And more importantly, they made me realize something. Keisha sat back on her heels, her eyes bright, with an idea that was clearly taking shape. How many other families are dealing with this same situation? How many qualified caregivers are being dismissed because they don't fit some arbitrary standard? How many children are losing out on excellent care because of prejudice? Probably more than we'd like to think, Marcus admitted. So what if we did something about it? Over the next hour, as Ethan played and occasionally interrupted with questions about whether they could have ice cream for lunch, Keisha outlined an idea that took Marcus's breath away. A foundation that would provide scholarships and support for caregivers of color pursuing education in childcare, nursing, and education. A program that would also work with families to find qualified professional caregivers while challenging institutions to examine their own biases. We could call it the Thompson-Williams Foundation, Keisha said, her voice gaining momentum with each word. We'd focus on breaking down barriers in childcare and education, professional development mentorship advocacy. That's brilliant, Marcus said, already thinking about the logistics. We could start with nursing scholarships, expand into early childhood education programs. And we could work with schools like Riverside to provide diversity training, help them understand what they're missing when they judge caregivers by appearance rather than qualifications. 2 months later, the Thompson-Williams Foundation held its inaugural event in the ballroom of the Grand Hyatt Seattle. Marcus had initially wanted something smaller, more intimate, but Keisha insisted they think bigger. If we're going to challenge people's assumptions, she'd said, we need to do it where they can see us. The turnout exceeded their wildest expectations. 200 people filled the elegant space, tech executives, healthcare professionals, educators, and dozens of caregivers and nursing students who'd heard about the foundation through community networks. Marcus stood at the podium for the opening remarks, looking out at an audience that was more diverse than any Seattle charity event he'd ever attended. 6 months ago, he began, I made one of the worst mistakes of my life. I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment, and I nearly destroyed the most important relationship in my son's life. He told the story honestly, unflinchingly. The fever, the misunderstanding his racist assumptions, and Keisha's dignity in the face of his verbal assault. He talked about discovering her medical training, her sacrifice for her grandmother, and the way she'd continued to put Ethan's well-being first, even after being humiliated. But this foundation isn't about my guilt or my redemption, Marcus continued. It's about making sure that qualified caring professionals like Keisha Williams get the opportunities they deserve. It's about challenging institutions to see past their biases. And it's about creating a world where children get the best possible care, regardless of what that caregiver looks like. When he stepped down from the podium, the applause was sustained and genuine. But the real moment came when Keisha took the microphone. She wore a navy blue dress and her grandmother's pearl earrings, her hair styled in soft curls around her shoulders. She looked poised and professional, but when she spoke, her voice carried the warmth and authenticity that had made Ethan love her so deeply. My name is Keisha Williams, she began, and I am a nursing student, a childcare professional, and living proof that excellence comes in many forms. She talked about her journey from cleaning houses to pursue her education, about the wisdom passed down from her grandmother, about the intersection of traditional knowledge and modern medicine. She spoke about the children she'd cared for, the families she'd supported, and the dreams she'd nearly given up. But mostly, she said, looking directly at Marcus and Ethan, who sat in the front row, I want to talk about how love and commitment can overcome even the deepest misunderstandings, how a moment of crisis can become a catalyst for change, and how sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can create the most powerful results. The audience rose to their feet as one. Marcus watched through tears as dozens of women of color in the audience stood and applauded, seeing themselves reflected in Keisha's story and her success. After the speeches during the reception, Marcus found himself in conversation after conversation with people who wanted to contribute, to volunteer, to share their own stories of bias and resilience. A tech CEO offered to fund a coding boot camp for single mothers. A pediatrician volunteered to mentor nursing students. A group of wealthy mothers pledged to advocate for policy changes in their children's schools. But the moment that meant the most came near the end of the evening. Mrs. Caroline Westbrook from Riverside Academy approached their table, her expression sheepish and uncertain. "Mr. Thompson, Miss Williams," she said hesitantly, "I wanted to apologize. Tonight has been eye-opening." Keisha looked up at her calmly. "How so?" "I realize now that our evaluation process was flawed. We were so focused on maintaining our image that we failed to see your qualifications, your medical training, your dedication, your obvious love for Ethan." Mrs. Westbrook paused. "I'd like to invite you to reconsider enrollment for next year, and I'd welcome the opportunity to have you speak to our parent community about quality childcare." Marcus started to respond, but Keisha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Thank you for the apology, Mrs. Westbrook. That means a lot. As for enrollment, we've actually found a wonderful program that values both academic excellence and diversity. But I'd be happy to speak to your parents about recognizing and supporting quality caregivers." It was a gracious response that left the door open, while making it clear that they'd moved beyond needing Riverside's approval. Later that night, after the event wound down and they'd returned home, Marcus found Keisha and Ethan on the living room floor, working on a puzzle of the solar system. "How does it feel?" he asked, settling down beside them. "Like the beginning of something big," Keisha replied, helping Ethan find the piece that completed Jupiter. "Look, Daddy," Ethan said, pointing to the completed planet. "Miss Keisha helped me find the missing piece." Marcus looked at his son, then at Keisha, then at the puzzle that was finally whole. "Yeah, buddy," he said softly. "She really did." 5 years later, Keisha Williams Thompson stood in the main corridor of Seattle Children's Hospital adjusting the stethoscope around her neck as she reviewed the patient charts for her evening rounds. The nameplate on her white coat read, "Keisha Williams Thompson, RN BSN Head of Pediatric Care Unit," a title that still filled her with quiet pride every time she saw it. Her nursing degree had taken 3 years to complete while working and caring for Ethan, but the Thompson-Williams Foundation had not only covered her tuition, but provided childcare support and mentorship that made the impossible suddenly achievable. She'd graduated summa cum laude past her boards on the first try and been offered her dream job before she'd even finished her final clinical rotation. "Nurse Keisha," a small voice called from down the hallway. She turned to see 7-year-old Maya Chen, one of her regular patients, rolling toward her in a wheelchair with her mother walking alongside. Maya had been born with a heart defect that required frequent monitoring, and over the past 2 years, she and Keisha had developed the kind of bond that made this job more than just a career. "Maya, how are you feeling today, sweetheart?" "Good, I brought you something." Maya held up a crayon drawing of 2 figures in white coats standing beside a hospital bed. "That's you and me when I become a nurse, too." Keisha's heart swelled as she accepted the artwork. "This is beautiful. I'm going to hang it in my office right next to all the others." Maya's mother squeezed Keisha's hand gratefully. "She talks about you constantly. You've given her something to aspire to." It was moments like these that reminded Keisha why she'd fought so hard to get here. Not just for herself, but for all the children who needed to see someone who looked like them in positions of authority and care. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Running late for dinner. Tell Ethan I'll be there for dessert. Love you." Keisha smiled at the casual intimacy of the message. Their relationship had evolved slowly, naturally over the years. What started as professional respect had deepened into friendship, then partnership, and finally love. Not the dramatic Hollywood kind of romance, but something steadier and more profound. A love built on shared values, mutual respect, and the daily choice to support each other's dreams. The wedding had been small and elegant, held in the backyard of the house they now shared with Ethan as the ring bearer and her grandmother as the matron of honor. Keisha had kept her name professionally but hyphenated it personally, a compromise that honored both her identity and their new family unit. At 6 p.m., she finished her rounds and headed home to the house in Capitol Hill that Marcus had renovated to accommodate their growing family. They'd moved from his sterile mansion to something warmer, more lived in, with a garden where Ethan could play and a home office where Keisha could work on foundation business. She found Ethan in the kitchen, now 9 years old and tall for his age, helping Gerald prepare dinner. The elderly man had insisted on staying with them through the transition, claiming he was too old to train a new family in proper tea service. Mama Keisha, Ethan called out using the name that had evolved naturally over time. I made salad. It looks perfect, she said, kissing the top of his head. She'd never pushed him to call her anything other than her name. But as their family had solidified, he'd started experimenting with Mama Keisha, testing how it felt on his tongue. When Marcus had asked if it bothered her, she'd simply said, he gets to decide who his family is. Where's your dad? Conference call with Singapore. He said something about closing a deal. Ethan rolled his eyes with the practiced exasperation of a child who'd grown up around business talk. Marcus appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, tie loosened and hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it. At 47, he'd grown more comfortable with himself, less rigid about appearances, and more focused on substance. Sorry I'm late, he said, kissing Keisha's cheek and ruffling Ethan's hair. The Taiwan project finally came through. That's wonderful, Keisha said, genuinely pleased. Marcus's company had grown significantly over the past 5 years, partly because his reputation for ethical business practices and community involvement had attracted clients who valued more than just profit margins. Over dinner, they discussed their days with the easy familiarity of a family that had learned to communicate openly. Ethan talked about his science project on renewable energy. Marcus shared news about a potential partnership with a tech company in Ghana. Keisha described Maya's drawing and the new pediatric mental health program the hospital was launching. Speaking of the foundation, Marcus said, reaching for the bottle of wine they'd opened to celebrate his business deal. I got a call from Portland today. They want to replicate our caregiver training program. That's incredible, Keisha said. How many cities would that make? 12. From Seattle to Miami to Detroit, over 2,000 caregivers trained, 500 nursing scholarships awarded. Marcus shook his head in amazement. Remember when we thought we'd be lucky to help a dozen people? The Thompson Williams Foundation had exceeded every expectation they'd set. What started as a way to address one injustice had grown into a national model for supporting underrepresented communities in healthcare and childcare. Keisha now split her time between her hospital work and foundation activities, speaking at conferences, consulting with organizations, and mentoring young women who reminded her of herself 5 years ago. Mama Keisha, Ethan said, stabbing at his broccoli with theatrical reluctance. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you remember when Daddy fired you? The question caught both adults off guard. They'd been honest with Ethan about their history, age-appropriately explaining the misunderstanding that had led to their current family structure, but he rarely brought it up directly. I do remember, Keisha said carefully. Why do you ask? Because Tommy at school said his dad heard about it, and he thinks it's weird that we're a family now. Ethan looked between his parents. He said people don't usually marry their boss after getting fired. Marcus and Keisha exchanged a look. They'd known this conversation would come eventually. Tommy's dad isn't wrong that it's unusual, Marcus said, but families come together in all kinds of ways. What matters isn't how we started, but how we chose to grow together. Your dad made a mistake based on fear and misunderstanding, Keisha added, but he was brave enough to admit it and work to fix it. And I was brave enough to forgive him and build something new. Ethan considered this. So the bad thing led to good things. Sometimes that's how life works, Keisha said. The worst moments can become the beginning of the best parts of your story if you're willing to learn and change. Like how you became a nurse because you took care of me when I was sick. Exactly like that. After dinner, as they cleaned up the kitchen together, Keisha felt the familiar flutter in her stomach that had been her constant companion for the past few months. She placed a hand over her abdomen where their daughter was growing, due to arrive in just 3 months. They'd waited to expand their family until Ethan was settled, Keisha's career was established, and their relationship had the deep roots that could weather the chaos of a newborn. The pregnancy had been planned, celebrated, and thoroughly discussed, but it still felt miraculous that this was their life now. Penny for your thoughts, Marcus said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she loaded the dishwasher. Just thinking about how different everything is from 5 years ago. Better different, much better different. She leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come home early that day? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I think we would have found our way to each other eventually. Maybe not as family, but you're too remarkable to go unnoticed forever. That's very romantic, Mr. Thompson. I have my moments, Mrs. Williams-Thompson. Later that evening, after Ethan had been tucked into bed with a story and Gerald had retired to his quarters with a cup of tea and a crossword puzzle, Marcus and Keisha sat on their back porch swing, watching the lights of Seattle twinkle in the distance. "I got a letter today," Keisha said, pulling an envelope from her sweater pocket. "From the first scholarship recipient. She graduated from nursing school last month and got a job at Johns Hopkins." "That's wonderful." She wrote that she named her daughter Keisha, said she wanted her to grow up knowing that dreams are possible even when the path isn't straight. Marcus squeezed her hand. "That little girl will have quite a role model. All these women do. Every scholarship recipient, every caregiver who stands up for herself, every family that chooses love over prejudice." Keisha looked out at the city lights. "We're not just changing individual lives anymore. We're changing the conversation." "Speaking of changing conversations," Marcus said with a smile in his voice, "Ethan asked me today if the baby would call you Mama Keisha too. What did you tell him?" "That it's up to her, but that she'll be very lucky if she does." As they sat in comfortable silence, Keisha reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that terrible afternoon in Marcus's kitchen to this moment of quiet contentment, it had been a road marked by pain, growth, forgiveness, and ultimately love. The foundation would continue to grow. Their daughter would be born into a family that valued both heritage and progress. Ethan would grow up understanding that families can be complicated and beautiful and built on choice as much as biology. And Keisha Williams-Thompson, once dismissed as just the help, would continue to prove that excellence and dignity come in many forms, that second chances can lead to first-class lives, and that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings create the most powerful endings. "Ready to go inside?" Marcus asked as a cool breeze picked up. "In a minute," Keisha said, placing both hands on her growing belly. "I'm just thinking about what story we'll tell this little one about how her family came to be." "The truth," Marcus said simply. "That love won even when it shouldn't have been possible." And in the gentle evening air of Seattle, surrounded by the life they'd built together through courage, forgiveness, and unwavering commitment to doing better, that truth felt like the most beautiful story of all.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.